Imagine a country divided, where families fought each other, cities were ruined, and the future was uncertain. How did the American Civil War start, and why did it happen? In this video, we'll look at the main reasons that led to the war, like the fight over slavery, money, and states' rights. We'll explain everything clearly so you can understand why this war was so important. By the end, you'll know how the Civil War changed the United States and why it still matters today. Before the Syrian Civil War, Syria was controlled by President Bashar al-Assad and his family. Bashar became president in 2000 after his father, Hafez al-Assad, who ruled for nearly 30 years. The Assad family kept tight control over the government, and only one political party, the Ba'ath Party, could rule. People didn't have the freedom to speak out or choose other leaders. If someone disagreed with the government, they could face punishment. Syria's economy relied on farming, oil, and some industries, but many people were poor and struggled to find jobs. The gap between the rich and the poor grew bigger. Bashar al-Assad stayed in power with help from the military and secret police. Over time, many Syrians became unhappy with the lack of freedom, the government's corruption, and the tough living conditions, which eventually led to protests and the start of the Civil War. In 2011, the Arab Spring spread across the Middle East as people protested against their governments, demanding more freedom, better jobs, and an end to corruption. It started in Tunisia and quickly spread to countries like Egypt, Libya, and Syria. In Syria, many were inspired by these protests and began demanding change from President Bashar al-Assad's government. People wanted more political freedom, better living conditions, and an end to the government's control. At first, the protests were peaceful, with people marching for their rights. However, the government responded with force, using the military and police to stop the protests. This harsh response angered people even more, and the protests eventually turned into a civil war. The protests in Syria began in the town of Dara in March 2011. It started when a group of children wrote anti-government graffiti on a wall, inspired by protests in other countries. The government responded by arresting the children, which angered many people in the town. Parents and local residents demanded their release. The government refused. As protests grew, security forces used violence to stop them, even shooting at the protesters. This made people even more upset, and soon, protests spread to other cities and towns in Syria. What began as a small protest in Dara quickly grew into a larger movement against President Bashar al-Assad's government, eventually leading to the outbreak of the Syrian Civil War. When protests began in Syria in 2011, the government of President Bashar al-Assad responded with violence. Instead of listening to the people's demands, the government sent police and military forces to stop the protests. The security forces used force, including shooting at peaceful protesters. The government also arrested many protesters, including children, and even tortured some. This harsh response only made the anger grow, and more people joined the protests. What began as peaceful demonstrations soon turned into a bigger rebellion. As the violence continued, the protests spread across the country. The government's violent crackdown on its own people played a major role in turning the situation into a civil war. As the Syrian government used violence against peaceful protesters, many people became frustrated and turned to armed resistance. Some soldiers in the Syrian army who disagreed with the government's actions began to defect. They joined the protests and formed a new group called the Free Syrian Army (FSA). The FSA started fighting against the government's forces, hoping to remove President Bashar al-Assad from power. Other rebel groups also formed, and they joined the fight against the government. What started as peaceful protests quickly became an armed struggle. The government's military clashed with the FSA and other rebel groups, and this marked the beginning of a full-scale civil war in Syria. As the Syrian Civil War grew, many foreign countries became involved, each supporting different sides. President Bashar al-Assad's government received strong support from Russia and Iran. Russia provided airstrikes and military equipment, while Iran sent fighters and weapons to help Assad's forces. Both countries wanted to keep Assad in power because Syria was an important ally for them in the Middle East. On the other side, various rebel groups received support from the West, Turkey, and other countries. The United States and European countries sent money, weapons, and training to help the rebels. Turkey also supported some groups, especially those fighting Assad. This foreign involvement made the war more complex and harder to resolve. As the Syrian civil war went on, extremist groups like ISIS began to rise. ISIS, which stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, took advantage of the chaos and seized large areas in both Syria and Iraq. They declared a caliphate and used extreme violence to control the land, including bombings, killings, and terror attacks. The presence of ISIS made the war even more complicated. It distracted both the Syrian government and rebel groups from their main goals. Other extremist groups also appeared, splitting the opposition. The violence from these groups added another layer of danger to the war, making it harder for anyone to work together and find a solution. The Syrian civil war has caused a terrible loss of life, with hundreds of thousands of people killed, including many civilians. Millions of others have been injured or forced to live in unsafe conditions. In addition to the deaths, the war has displaced millions of Syrians. Many people have moved to safer areas within Syria, while others fled to neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Some even risked dangerous journeys to Europe in search of safety. This has created one of the largest refugee crises in history, with millions of Syrians still living in camps or struggling to find a stable and safe place to live. The Syrian civil war has caused terrible suffering for civilians. Many cities, like Aleppo and Homs, have been destroyed due to constant fighting and bombings. Homes, schools, hospitals, and shops have all been damaged or ruined. The government has also used chemical weapons against civilians, causing many deaths and injuries, especially among children. These attacks have made the suffering even worse. Every day, Syrians have faced extreme hardship. Many have lost their homes, loved ones, and access to food, water, and medical care. The war has made life unbearable for ordinary people who just want to survive and live in peace. The global response to the Syrian civil war has been mixed. Many countries and organizations have provided aid, such as food, medical supplies, and support for refugees. The United Nations and other groups have set up refugee programs to help Syrians who fled to other countries, like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. There have also been calls for international intervention to end the war, but this has been difficult. Different countries have different opinions on how to handle the situation. Some support the Syrian government, while others back the rebels. This has made it hard for the world to agree on a solution, and the war continues without a clear end in sight. President Bashar al-Assad has been central to the Syrian civil war. Since becoming president in 2000, he has ruled Syria with tight control, using the military and secret police to maintain power. When protests started in 2011, Assad refused to step down and use violence to crush the demonstrations. He has strong support from Russia and Iran. Russia provides airstrikes and military help, while Iran sends weapons and fighters. These alliances have helped Assad keep control. Throughout the war, Assad has been determined to stay in power, even at the cost of violence and suffering for the Syrian people. Many groups have opposed President Bashar al-Assad during the Syrian civil war. The Free Syrian Army (FSA), made up of defected soldiers, wanted to remove Assad and create a more democratic government. Kurdish forces, mainly the Syrian Democratic Forces (SDF), fought to protect the Kurdish people and create their own autonomous region in northern Syria. Other rebel groups had different goals, like establishing an Islamic State or gaining control over certain areas. These groups had different strategies and goals, which made it difficult for them to unite and work together against Assad's government. Foreign powers have played a key role in the Syrian civil war. Russia and Iran have supported President Bashar al-Assad's government. Russia provided airstrikes and military help, while Iran sent fighters and weapons to protect Assad, as Syria is a key ally in the region. On the other side, the United States, Turkey, and other Western countries supported rebel groups. The U.S. sent weapons, money, and training to help the opposition, while Turkey backed groups fighting near its border. These foreign interventions complicated the war, making it harder for a peaceful solution to be reached. As of now, the Syrian civil war is still ongoing, but the situation has changed. The Syrian government, led by President Assad, controls most of the country, including major cities like Damascus and Aleppo. However, some areas are still controlled by rebel groups, including parts of the northwest, where Turkey has influence, and the northeast, where Kurdish forces are in control. Violence still continues in some regions, especially where rebel and government forces clash. Peace negotiations have taken place, but there has been little progress in ending the war. Millions of people are still displaced, and the country faces many challenges in rebuilding. The Syrian civil war has caused long-lasting damage to Syria, the region, and the world. Politically, Syria remains divided, and the government struggles to maintain control in some areas. Socially, millions of Syrians have lost their homes and families, and many remain as refugees in other countries, facing difficult lives. The war has caused emotional trauma for many people. Economically, Syria is in ruins. Cities, industries, and infrastructure have been destroyed, making rebuilding very difficult. The country will need a lot of money and time to recover, and it is unclear how long it will take to restore stability. The Syrian civil war started in 2011 with peaceful protests, inspired by the Arab Spring, calling for political freedom and an end to corruption. President Bashar al-Assad's government responded with violence, using the military to crush the protests. This led to larger demonstrations and calls for Assad's removal. As the violence increased, peaceful protests turned into armed resistance. Defectors from the army formed the Free Syrian Army (FSA), and many rebel groups joined the fight. The war became even more complicated with the rise of extremist groups like ISIS. Conflict caused massive destruction, loss of life, and millions of refugees, and continues to affect Syria and the region. Understanding the Syrian civil war is important for several reasons. It has greatly affected global politics, with countries like Russia, the US, and Turkey taking sides and influencing the course of the war. The war has also caused a massive humanitarian crisis, with millions of Syrians killed, injured, or displaced. Many live as refugees in other countries, and the world needs to recognize this suffering to offer help. Finally, the war's outcome will shape the future of the Middle East, affecting the region's politics and the relationships between countries for years to come. What are your thoughts on the Syrian civil war? Drop your comments or questions below. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe for more content on global history and current events. Stay tuned for future videos, and thank you for watching.